We're so happy
Zoom.
to have you with us. Thank you, Jeff, for joining us. Just
My
a
pleasure.
short introduction for those. Many people know you here in Denmark, and you are highly respected in many circles. It's a great honor to have you here. Those who do not know the name Jeffrey Sachs, former Harvard professor in economics, advisor to the UN General Secretary, former director of the Earth Institute, and now you are chairing the Center for Sustainable Development. You are one of the most important voices in dealing with the crisis here. And there are so many disturbing, frightening things. So we need your good analysis, your experience, and your clear view. So thank you very much for joining us here, and thank you for spending time with us here in Denmark. A sunny afternoon where spring is turning into summer. And now we have half an hour, and I'll give the word to you, and then you will use all the time you want. And if there is more time than you use, we have some questions. But now the word is yours, Jeff.
Thank you so much, Mikkel. And I'll speak briefly because I'd rather move almost immediately to question and discussion in general. So I won't say question and answer, but deliberation and pondering. The world is in a very dangerous situation today. This war is already creating mass destruction, death, and dislocation. It's on top of many other extreme global tensions and an ongoing pandemic. So we are really piling on the shocks and the burdens. And I don't see us taking the precautionary and the prudent steps to try to find our way out of this. I believe that there is a solution to this war that is a legitimate and right solution, and that I hypothesize could end this war in a short period of time. It's based on one idea, and the idea is that NATO should not expand to Ukraine. Ukraine should be a neutral country. Russia should leave Ukraine. We should implement and support the implementation of arrangements that were in the Minsk I and Minsk II agreements. And we should try to rewind the clock before we lose complete control of this crisis. I believe that this was a war that obviously is utterly unjustified, but nonetheless was provoked as well by US actions in particular. I regard NATO as a US-led military alliance. I don't regard it, with all respect to Denmark, which I love, I don't regard it as a partnership. I regard it as a US-led military alliance. A very senior, a leader of Europe said to me in the past month, Biden treats us like children. That is the truth. That's not, that's very odd to hear from a leader, but, and it's obviously not someone I'm going to quote because of the problems that it would entail, but it is the truth. So we're talking about a US-led military alliance. We should never have suggested that NATO go right up to the Russian border. And that was the idea of George Bush, one of our worst presidents. By the way, we just keep getting worse and worse, so I never know how bad. But George Bush had a terrible idea in 2008, promoted by the US deep state, that we should invite Ukraine and Georgia in the Caucasus, no less, to join NATO. Now, this is, in my view, sheerly provocative and reckless, and but also deliberate, not accidental. It is part of U.S. Fundamental policy promoting U.S. primacy is the term that the U.S. uses. Hegemony is the term that political theorists use. But the idea is that Ukraine and Georgia are geographical pivot states whose control affects power throughout Eurasia. And I believe that US policymakers have had their eye on Ukraine for a long time. Now, it's also true Ukrainians, many or most, maybe these days almost all, would like to be in the Western embrace. But the US also has its eye on Ukraine for other reasons, which is to bottle up, to isolate, to weaken Russia. And the point is that Russia views the matter that way and has said so for decades. And I've heard it said for decades. This is not a new idea. It's not an invention even of Putin. It's certainly not, as is told by our media every day, an excuse or a false lead. We have our own narrative in the West right now, which is that Putin is Hitler, a madman who wants to recreate the Russian Empire, and that anything said about NATO enlargement is just an excuse, and you have to be a fool and a Putin lover to believe that. Well, I'm not a Putin lover and I'm not a fool, but I do believe it, and I don't believe our media very much because I know how it is fed daily in the United States by the US government. In fact, that is the main way that foreign policy stories are presented in the United States. I'd say overwhelmingly the case. And I don't believe our narrative. Well, be that as it may, we walked into a disaster and find ourselves in a disaster. In 2021, following years of Russian complaints about US meddling in Ukraine, many of which I know firsthand to be true because I've witnessed it, including the US role in the overthrow of the pro-Russian president in 2014. Putin called for negotiations to stop NATO enlargement. Biden rejected those out of hand and would not discuss the issue of NATO enlargement during 2021. Putin described rather vividly the security risks that NATO enlargement would entail. The US met that not by negotiating, but by actually 3 major statements supporting Ukraine's membership in NATO. First, at the 2021 NATO summit, then in a Defense Department defense memorandum with the government of Ukraine in the summer of 2021, and then with a foreign policy memorandum agreed by the State Department and the government of Ukraine in the fall of 2021, all of which emphasized that Ukraine's right to join NATO would be honored and respected, and the United States supported that. Not only did we not try to diffuse the situation, we absolutely aggravated it, deliberately so. In the White House, the decision was taken not only by the president, but he canvassed the cabinet, that there should be no negotiations over this issue, that this was a non-negotiable issue from the point of view of the United States. Well, it was not negotiated. Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th of this year. Zelensky soon afterwards said it's clear that Ukraine is not really welcome to join NATO, so Ukraine would consider neutrality if suitable security guarantees could be found. And that was the beginning of negotiations that followed 2 rounds of mediation, first by Prime Minister Bennett of Israel, and then later by President Erdogan of Turkey. At the end of March, announcements were made by all 3 participants in the Turkish-led mediation, by the Ukrainians, by the Russians, and by Turkey, that significant progress had been made and documents had been exchanged that looked like we were heading towards a peaceful agreement. Suddenly that stopped. Now, the reports of the atrocities in Bucha occurred around that time. The Ukrainian negotiators announced around that time that under the circumstances, they could not continue the negotiations. And around the same time, the United States and UK both announced expanded war aims, that the goal was to win the war, defeat Russia, and weaken and permanently isolate Russia. And whatever the United States says, the UK jumps 10 times higher. They want to prove how loyal they are to the United States. It's almost an embarrassment. It's been that way for decades now, in the Iraq War, now again in Ukraine. The UK is unhinged, in my view. The United States is untrustworthy. But suddenly, in April, all talk of negotiations ended. And we had our Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, talk about the imminent victory of Ukraine. Ukraine said that we will defeat Russia. We will not negotiate until we push Russia out of Ukraine. Many US congressmen and senators stated that the goal was to defeat Putin. Leading British commentators said that the main goal was to make sure that Putin lost, because any sign of, quote, winning would only be an encouragement. So we had to make sure that Putin lost. That has now gone on for about 6 weeks, and the talks have not progressed. And when Putin said talks reached a dead end, of course, the Western media immediately announced Russia not interested in peace talks. But our stupid media, which is so phony by the day, didn't even read the second line of Putin's statement, which said, because the Ukrainians withdrew their offer. And that was not reported. But it's not even contested, actually, because the Ukrainians have said explicitly, we can't negotiate with these people. We won't negotiate with these people. I don't know whether this is a Ukrainian view or a US imposed view, although I have heard reports that it's a US view, because the US has said, if you want tens of billions of dollars of armaments, we do it the other way. And I don't know, because I'm not in the room, but I do know that what was reported as significant progress disappeared from the table. What we have underway at the least is a war of attrition right now. And the idea that Russia is imminently to be defeated strikes me as foolishness. I am not a military commander, and I am not in the field, and I am not privy to any information that we're not all able to receive. But it does not strike me as likely at all that Putin is about to be defeated. And yesterday's defeat of the troops that were sheltering, as it were, in the Azovstal steel plant and their surrender yesterday strikes me as making it even less likely that there is going to be an imminent defeat. I believe that Russia will hold a significant amount of land along the Black Sea coast and in Lugansk and Donetsk, and that battles will continue to rage and people will continue to die, and all through Ukraine, there will be mass destruction and dislocation. And I may be wrong, but even with the clear technological superiority of NATO weaponry, I doubt that that is sufficient to defeat a Russian army that is intent on not being defeated. This would be calamitous for the Putin regime, and that suggests that among many other reasons that this is unlikely to result in some declaration sometime in the coming days that, well, we've seen that we can't proceed, so we're withdrawing. I doubt that. I think we're in for a lot of fighting, destruction, and dislocation. Now, in the meantime, there are two other significant points. One is that the destruction and the spillover effects are huge all over the world, starting with Europe, which definitely will have an economic crisis from this, and in many parts of the developing world, we are probably entering a very serious global economic crisis as a result of this. And the longer it lasts, the more prolonged will be this crisis. Second, I regard it as reckless, the idea of defeating or aiming to defeat a nuclear superpower with 1,600 active nuclear weapons. And I find it mind-boggling that my Ukrainian, I can't say friends because they're very unhappy with me, but erstwhile friends, and I'm still friendly with them, say to me at the same time, how can you speak of negotiating with this genocidal maniac and at the same moment turn around and say, but there's no risk of nuclear war? But that's the paradox that the Ukrainians want me to believe. And I know enough history to believe that that is absolute rubbish. We are at risk of nuclear war, and the risk would rise if it happened that the conventional war turns decisively against the Russians. And so even the idea of defeat of Putin strikes me as an extraordinarily dangerous idea under these circumstances, as opposed to an idea of finding a solution. Now, my idea of solution from the beginning, actually starting back in 2008, was don't expand NATO, because that is provocative. My knowledge of Russian history and statecraft, which is pretty extensive at this point after 40 years of working on this, is that Russia wants space in between the West and itself. This is a pretty fundamental part of Russian security views and statecraft views. This is not an illusion. The idea that Russia would not like NATO on Ukrainian soil up against Russia's border is not an excuse, it's a reality. And there are real reasons for that reality, and there are historical and cultural belief reasons for that being a reality of belief of Russian statecraft as well. So my view has been, don't do this. Agreeing to non-expansion is not a concession or appeasement. It is prudence. It is absolutely wrong-headed and dangerous to put NATO into Ukraine. And the idea that any country can choose its military alliance has no moral, ethical, or practical value as a doctrine. It makes no sense. It's a phony idea. It is just playing on the idea of freedom of choice without understanding that joining a military alliance has huge externalities for everybody. And if Ukraine were to join NATO, the world would be more dangerous for Europe, for the United States, for Russia, and therefore also for Ukraine. This makes no sense. And therefore, I believe that we still have a way forward. The way forward for me is a hypothesis that Ukrainian neutrality can be the linchpin for a peace settlement and for Russia's withdrawal. It may be too late, but I would still try it. I would say that we recognize Russia's security interests, we recognize Ukraine's sovereignty, and we therefore call for an arrangement in which Russia withdraws, Ukrainian sovereignty is restored, and neutrality is guaranteed by the UN Security Council. Now, this may no longer be sufficient under the circumstances to get us anywhere. There are territorial issues that are, of course, absolutely real. One is Crimea. I have absolutely no solution for that other than that it is going to remain in Russia's hands because it is a fundamental part of Russian state security. And I see no way around that. I think Khrushchev's birthday present of Crimea to Ukraine in 1954 was a little bit harebrained, but it was irrelevant in 1954 when there was the Soviet Union. But it makes a big difference now when there are independent states and Russia's naval fleet happens to be in Sevastopol, as it has been for 160 years. Actually, it's really going back to the end of the 18th century. So I see no practical answer to that other than to acknowledge that Crimea, even if we protest it, is likely to remain in Russian hands. The other issues involved the Donbass, and there the situation was that agreements were reached about the Donbass in 2015, the so-called Minsk I and Minsk II agreements, and Ukraine did not implement those. And even though Europe was guarantor of the Minsk agreements, Europe also did not press Ukraine to intervene. And when I've said that to my Ukrainian friends, they say, well, those were terrible agreements. They were under duress. We don't want to honor them. Well, we hear every day that Putin doesn't honor any agreements, but this is pretty clear case, as I understand it, that Ukraine did not honor what had been agreed. And that's pretty unpopular to say in the West, but I think it's also part of our challenge of finding a way out of this deep crisis to understand the circumstances. So the idea of the Minsk I and Minsk II agreements was to give some kind of protection to Russian speakers and some kind of autonomy to these regions bordering Russia. And those were agreed. And it seems to me that they should be the basis for some kind of settlement or negotiation, at least on this. So at the core, I believe that neutrality is the most important issue. And I believe that neutrality also is the key to bringing more of the world on side, to also press Putin that it's, if neutrality is achieved, that Russia has achieved its fundamental strategic aim in this, which is to prevent NATO enlargement, and that it's time for the war to end in the interest of Russia and the whole world. And I think that that also would be helpful in bringing China on side as an active participant to help find a reasonable solution. Well, suffice it to say, these views are almost not discussed at all in the United States. It's even hard for me to get an op-ed printed with these views, which is, just to put it in context, I have written op-eds with high frequency for 40 years and do not have trouble placing op-eds. But we're in a moment of propaganda, fervor, us versus them mentality. And so editors are absolutely not ready even to publish this kind of analysis. I get it published, but it's not easy. I can tell you, it's a little bit different from normal. Normally, I send in 800 to 1,000 words, and after a little bit of editing and some hyperlinks added, it gets published within hours. But this is a battle because the editors do not want to carry these stories. The New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post will not discuss these issues in any length. The background to this war is not known or discussed by and large outside of academic circles in the United States. The Congress basically will not discuss this or hold hearings on this issue. And my favorite places in Europe are jumping to the cause. I'm seeing people who should be diplomats acting as war leaders and trying to show we're not just diplomats, we know how to fight a war, we're tough. And this is not Europe's interest right now. Europe's interest is ending this war. Europe's interest is in having Russia withdraw from Ukraine. It is in saving lives. It is not in defending US primacy or views about US hegemony. And by the way, the US intends to make NATO an expeditionary force for the US in Asia as well. And I am just shocked at, I'm sorry to say, at somebody that I have liked and admired for a long time, at Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, really promoting the anti-China line for NATO. Because the US view in our foreign policy doctrine is we have two enemies, China and Russia, and they threaten US primacy. And I don't believe in US primacy as a goal. I don't believe in hegemony. I don't much like the US foreign policy, almost beginning to end, I have to say. I don't believe in the cliches of the liberal order because I know how much damage and how selfish the United States is to the rest of the world anyway. But I don't trust the US to keep us out of war and out of conflict. And I don't understand why Europe is rallying to an expanded NATO, even to the point of NATO having some kind of role vis-a-vis China. Are we kidding? What are we thinking? And where are the European leaders to talk about peace and security and cooperation and sustainable development? So let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I think your analysis is very needed. And as a European and as a Dane, I simply don't understand why there is so much aggression in rhetoric and in politics for the moment, even in Scandinavia, where we usually have a tendency of a more detailed analysis of a situation. It seems as if people are in love with black and white heroes and villains, and then truth is the first thing to disappear. I know we have only half an hour, and you have already spent more than half an hour with us here.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I talked so long, but let's take a little bit of discussion.
Okay, just a few questions. The enlargement of NATO, if I'm not wrong, many people have warned strongly against it. The former US ambassador to Moscow from 87 till 91 or 90.
Jack Matlock, yeah.
Matlock warned it. Mearsheimer, professor, your colleague in Chicago, and if I'm not wrong, Kissinger warned against it.
Strongly in 2014.
When we mention that, I've tried to mention it in newspaper articles from time to time. Nobody listened. Why? It's not an argument that plays any role. We have even the foreign minister in Denmark saying, I'm not interested in the past. I'm interested in what's happening just now. So the motives from Russia, where they say we are watching an enlargement of NATO that is disturbing to us, that's why we react. Of course, the reaction is terrible and wrong, but how come that the analysis of the development up to this point doesn't play an important role?
It's crucial that it does, because the dynamics of conflict depend on one's understanding of the motives of the other side. And if we don't attend to a full understanding, we fall into the trap, which we are in right now, of believing the worst of the other side and then responding according to the worst suppositions and fears. And this is a primitive way to respond. A foreign minister cannot say, I don't care about the past. That's an absurdity and a danger, because the past informs how we got to the present, and it informs what we should do in order to avoid disaster in the future. It's just not sensible in any way to take that view. If the foreign minister said, I don't believe that NATO had anything to do with it, then we can discuss that. But to say I don't care about the past is really a primitive idea, because, or just a misunderstanding of what the job is. The reason for caring about the past is to understand the dynamics that we're in, to understand what are the chances for a different approach. And the past actually is very illuminating in this. There's a history to this. And Russia makes many charges. Putin makes many charges, many of which are truthful, but they are not reported. Some are wrong, some are lies, some are propaganda, some are a point of view that we would not subscribe to, and many of them are truthful. The way one addresses that in a strategic dilemma like we're in right now is actually to sit down with the other side. So the foreign minister of Denmark should be sitting down with the foreign minister of Russia and discussing these issues. This is actually probably the most basic point of conflict resolution. The idea that there's no use discussing with the other side is the most dangerous idea in conflicts. And it is the wrong lesson that everybody has taken from Munich 1938, as if that's the only lesson of history. Even that lesson is much more complex than is accorded. But the idea that Chamberlain talked to Hitler and Hitler lied, and so we should never talk to opponents again, is actually the mindset. It's mind-boggling to me. It's wrong on every dimension of strategy, security, human relations, social psychology, and finding exit ramps but it is this dominant narrative. It's a narrative also of the US and power. Why talk to anybody? We'll win. That's the basic idea. And the US generally doesn't win the wars it claims to win. It ends up creating a lot of destruction. And I think the US is deeply misleading our Ukrainian friends right now. But I think that this idea that we don't need to understand the past is a bit of the US approach. After all, the two hardest things in America ever are, one, to get Americans interested in past history, and second, to get Americans interested in the rest of the world other than in bombing them. There's almost no discussion, knowledge, context of almost anything that America does. And that's why, by the way, the whole thing is so ironic. You can understand Europe wants a nuclear umbrella. In a nuclear age, the US is Europe's nuclear umbrella. But Europe knows so much more about history, about Europe, about Russia, about these challenges than the United States does. And to leave this to the United States is absolutely the wrong thing to do. There's really only one leader in Europe right now, interestingly, that thinks for himself, and that is President Macron. And it's probably not a coincidence, because France is the one country with the nuclear deterrent. That probably gives added space to the thinking. Everyone else runs under the US protection, so-called. But I can tell you it's not protection. I know America now, 67 years. I've been trying to figure out this country. This is not protection. They don't even think straight. And I know the people in this government. Many are my students, some are friends. But the naivete is extraordinary. And we have the hawkish side of the Democratic Party in the foreign policy establishment, the same one that brought us so many wrong-headed approaches in the past. And they're doing it again. And they're also afraid of the right wing. So we're in a mess, and Europe has more clarity, more understanding. And it's just a shame to me. Maybe it's understandable, but it's a shame to me that Finland and Sweden wouldn't have a little bit more ability to say, you know, this is dangerous, but we really have to take a deep breath. And before we do anything, we have to think, have we really exhausted all the ways to end this war by negotiation? And I wish that they would say that. Neutrality has not been bad for those two countries. Finland ranks #1, by the way, Denmark #2 on the happiness index that I co-edit each year. And Finland ranks #1, and I don't remember, Denmark probably again #2 on the Sustainable Development Goal Index. In other words, life's been pretty good under neutrality, and to suddenly throw it out this way really is not the right answer. But it also shows it's strange to me, because they should be the first to know, look, neutrality bought us some space. We want to advise our Ukrainian friends, you can get to happiness and sustainable development as a neutral country. Take it from us, we've done it. And that should have been the message. And they're not giving that wisdom, quite the opposite.
Jeff, it has been a privilege to listen to you, and I hope that your views and your analysis will broaden. And we would like to invite you, when you have the time, to a conference in Copenhagen, because there are so many aggressive attitudes and so many people climbing Mount Stupid that we need analysis, we need experience, and we need hope. And you have given those of us who fear the situation strongly a good kind of hope here, because first of all, if you have a good analysis on the situation, you begin to see solutions. And solutions have been very rare the last 3-4 weeks. But after listening to you, there's more hope. And
let us work on this together, and we'll figure out ways to keep pushing a message of peace. And
yeah.
I think when there's some realization that this bravado is actually not going to deliver what is claimed, maybe we will have an opening at that moment.
We'll hope. We'll keep fighting.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.